Opening, acknowledging the original custodians of this area, the Ngunnawal people, the fantastic situation we have that this is living country for the Ngunnawal people, the opportunity that we still have to begin to draw much more effectively working with the original custodians as we begin to adapt our management practices in relation to caring for this landscape into the future, and a future that's already being impacted by climate change. Hydrogeology is a very significant factor influencing human migration and land use management practices, both from the indigenous story and the early European settlement take-up of land for grazing. And there's one feature, building on Wayne's presentation, one feature of much of this region that has a very strong influence on the capacity of vegetation to adapt to particularly the drying situation. And that is a system of shallow aquifers, we call pedoderms, from colluvium material washing from the ridgeland over the last, or in the period of 25 to 40,000 years ago. So I'm talking about yesterday in terms of Wayne's much earlier background on the formation, the history of rock formation of this area. So to put that into context, 40,000 years ago, we were very much in a greenhouse period with active volcanic activity, so a very wet period. It was in that period that Lake Mungo was pretty much full. The Willandra river system still very active. 27,000 years ago and 21,000 years ago, Lake George overflowed over Gin's Gap. So just that volume of water in Lake George just gives you some idea of the extraordinary, how extraordinarily wet it was in that period. So it was in that period there was a lot of washout from the hill areas down onto the lower slopes and plains of gravel and sand and some silt to form pedoderms that are typically across this area around 2 to 4 meters thick. And in more recent drier periods, they have been overlain by a mantle of silty loam soils of around 2 to 3 meters thickness. The pedoderms, they cover large areas. The Horse Park pedoderm has an area of 1,500 hectares, huge system. During the 1999 to 2009 drought, at the end of that drought, that aquifer system was still discharging water, just to give you an idea of the extraordinary volume of water stored in those systems. Their impact on the landscape, there is the ability, because of the accumulation of water in those systems from the hill slopes, recharging those systems, infiltration of rain through the soil into those systems. It means plants have access to sustained moisture in the soils overlying those aquifers as a result of capillary rise of moisture in those systems. It also meant that those systems were limited tree-wise because the trees just didn't have the soil depth to really become established and sustain growth. So here was a large area of fertile grassland in that drying period of 20,000 years, and since that period, possibly a significant factor in terms of the drying of Lake Mungo and the further migration of Indigenous people into this area. And certainly a key element of the early take-up of land for grazing by early European settlement in the early 19th century. So just an idea of the significance of these, Wally. The way these shallow aquifers have influenced migration and land use. There have been two approaches to how we explain the landscape. And one of those are the indigenous mythical beings and time-based local land management practice. The other approach has been the European mythic sciences, the geology, the geomorphology, pedology and hydrology. And particularly the hydrology aspects, they were inherited, if you like, very much from a European development, early development of ideas, understanding of landscape, of water movement. And that was very much a system of surface water flow. But this is a very old country, very old soils, and the key to understanding this country is in fact the water storage and flow in the ground, and that is something that Indigenous people have an extraordinary understanding of. So it's taken us, more recent peoples coming to this land, taken us a long time to begin to listen to the landscape instead of imposing those European ideas. And one of the exciting opportunities of this time, our recognition of, we're now in an era of rapid adaptation of land, how to manage, to work with those processes. Okay, so I've just briefly touched there on some of the key elements of the hydrogeology of this region. Another feature of the region is the deeper groundwater systems. They are primarily fractured aquifers. So in terms of water movement and water abstraction, they are much more limited in terms of their servicing water supply. The scope of the shallow aquifers, there was a huge system in Tuggeranong, in Isabella Plains, which we systematically destroyed by putting in early drainage prior to urban development. We did a bit better on the Point Hutt catchment, whereby adopting a vegetated drainage channels rather than concrete pipes and drains, we managed to retain a number of aspects of the aquifers in that area. In Gungahlin, there's a big pediderm in the Gungadera area, which was protected with the designation of a grassland across that area. I've talked about the Horse Park pedoderm that has not yet been developed for urbanisation, but it will, parts of it will be, but in a way that totally protects that pedoderm. Ford has worked partly with the pedoderm, as has Grace, as we begin to change our urban development practices. So systems that sadly we have lost through just ignorance in the way in which we developed our urban areas, but now beginning to improve on that practice. Two of the big changes in response to our growing appreciation of the opportunities and constraints of the landscape we live in have been restoring some of the old interception and holding of water locally in the landscape. So for urban development, we have developed what is called water-sensitive urban design practices out of the work of the Cooperative Research Centre Freshwater Ecology in the mid-1990s. We discovered that the impairment of biodiversity of our aquatic systems was more about the way in which we had changed the pattern of flow in our rivers than it was about water pollution. And that really then drove the need to step back and look at ways in which we reduce that sudden surge of water, large area, impervious areas, very efficient concrete hydraulic drains, and this rush of water from storms. Runoff that pre-urbanisation would have happened over 8 hours to 36 hours, and as a result of urbanisation happened in 30 minutes. So it was just that huge concentration of flow that impacted on systems. So water-sensitive urban design, John Faint touched on in terms of disconnecting the downpipes, holding water on our local residential blocks, minimising impervious areas or going for porous pavers or open pavers, mulching, capturing roof runoff in rainwater tanks, reducing that rapid discharge from our residential areas. There's also been shifts in the rural area, and one important approach there has been Peter Andrews' natural sequence farming. Again, looking at how we hold and recycle water on the rural block, and I think, Peter, you're speaking to some of that practice this afternoon. That is quite exciting. It was interesting when Peter presented those ideas. We just did not have the science to explain how that could happen. But we are beginning now in our hydrology work to build the models, the understanding that firstly reintegrates the hydrological cycle, but also builds into that the role of vegetation and microclimate, dew point, as a way of explaining what happens as we begin to bring back the vegetation, the increase in rainfall afforded by much greater condensation, that reduction in dew point. So we have higher rainfall and of course much more local recycling, rehydrating the land that as a result of our clearing and earlier our overgrazing and the problem of rabbits, we've seriously impacted on those areas. All right, in finishing, I'd like to just draw on some of the experience on the Jerrabomberra Wetland Reserve, just across here, looking out onto it from here on the Molonglo floodplain, the eastern end of Lake Burley Griffin, an area of 200 hectares. Recently we've done quite a bit of investigation of that area, looking at the movement of water across that system, as previously we didn't have a clue where water was coming from for the wetlands in that area. Put in a lot of groundwater bores to measure water level, staves in the wetlands to look at changes in water level, and so begin to explore what is happening in that system. So on the back page of your handout, there are a couple of diagrams. The lower diagram just gives you a diagrammatic understanding of the layers, the soil mantle layer overlying the shallow aquifer and the deep groundwater aquifer system. So in the case of Jerrabomberra, we're looking at a 3 to 4 metres thickness of soil a mantle, quite a nice silty loam material. The aquifer, and in the case of the Molonglo floodplain, of course that aquifer is an alluvium one, based, not colluvium, so it's the result of major flood flows in the past in the Molonglo River system and movement of the river across that floodplain. What came out of that analysis in the graph is a very strong seasonal pattern in the depth of water, the height of water within that aquifer system. So what is evident is very little recharge of that system from Jerrabomberra Creek, and no apparent recharge from the Molonglo River of that aquifer system. So it's being recharged primarily by rainwater over that area, the infiltration in the winter period, and in the summer period, the capillary rise of water evapotranspiration from that system, drawing it down quite significantly. So it's a very nice indicator of how not only that system operates, but how our pedoderm, shallow aquifer systems operate. So gradually we're beginning to grow a better appreciation of the enormous resilience capacity of this landscape to cope with drying, something that it has done, as Wayne touched on, for certainly tens, hundreds of thousands of years with the gradual drying out of our climate. Thank you.
Is there any scientific evidence for water divining?
Water divining? What's that?
If you're a diviner, then yes, there is.
Yes, exactly. That's what my grandfather would say. My auntie would say yes.
You're hesitating, so I can see that it's a diving.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any scientific evidence, but then there is the indigenous peoples knowing of where water is, the chain of ponds. was a significant landscape element across this landscape. And there are still aspects of that here in the Majura Creek. It's there and then it disappears and then it reappears again. And that's a classical example of the pediderm systems, of the chain of ponds. The water was sustained by that interconnection with extensive underground aquifer. And yes, Indigenous people just have an ability to read that landscape and yeah.